Hello, it's good to see you again. This particular unit is actually Chapter 1 in your book for the class, but it's Unit 2 in the course. So, and this particular unit will be talking about title programs, federal title programs, and ESEA. And one thing I'll say is this chapter is not that long, but it's extremely important, because so many of the things that we do in title programs or in, listen to me there, special programs relate to title programming. So it's extremely important to understand the basic concepts of federal title programs, how the money works, and then also to understand ESEA and how that federal regulation will impact you. It promised me it will. If you work in public schools in any state, ESEA will be extremely important for you to understand. So this chapter, while may not be very lengthy in the book, is very, very important. So prior to watching this lecture, I hope that you've gone through and already read the chapter, and so you've gotten sort of a basic introduction of it, and then this lecture will be supplementary information that hopefully will highlight some what I think are extremely important areas that will be on the assessments later on in the course. So let's talk about the federal government in public education. You know, if you look at the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, it's very, very clear that those particular things that are not set out as powers given to the federal government are reserved to the states. And education is nowhere mentioned in the federal Constitution. Therefore, the 10th Amendment would say, since it's not mentioned in the Constitution as a power of the federal government, therefore the authority for education is left to the states. So what that does is that creates a wide variety of educational organizations in the 50 states of the United States, and sometimes that's caused problems, and sometimes it's allowed some flexibility where certain states can go through and model specific programs for their state which may not be appropriate in other states. But there is no doubt that federal government plays a large role in our education in public schools in any state now. And how does that happen when they're specifically excluded from having authority over education by the 10th Amendment? And the answer is money. You have to follow the money trail. Is that the federal government says, we will provide you money if you will follow our regulations. You don't have to participate in any of these federal title programs if you don't want to, but if you want the money, then it comes with strings attached as far as regulations. And that's where one of the biggest areas are the title programs that we're going to be talking about in this particular unit. But that's how the federal government gets its authority, is by giving us money. Now, there are exceptions to that, and that is the second bullet on this particular slide. The exceptions of where the federal government has a direct impact on education are through constitutionally protected rights, and typically that comes from court cases. Okay, so you may have a specific constitutional right that a child may have, and by a federal court case that typically goes through the Supreme Court, we're all bound to follow it. I mean, some of the best examples of where federal court cases have had a direct impact on education is, of course, well, things like Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, even though that was a court case in Kansas, which ironically that student came on to Missouri and graduated from school in Missouri. But Brown versus Topeka Board of Education was, of course, the well-known federal desegregation case, which said that the former court case that related to that, which was Plessy versus Ferguson, which that said separate but equal education was allowable, having, you know, in this particular case, an African-American school, a black school, and white schools. Plessy versus Ferguson said you could have separate educational organizations in a state as long as they're equal. Well, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education is a good example of where they said by having them separate, they're inherently unequal. And so by that particular court case in the 1950s, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, that made desegregation illegal, and so we no longer had a Springfield black education system and a Springfield white education or Caucasian education system. That was eliminated, and so there are examples of when federal court cases definitely do impact that, but that's typically because they're protecting federal rights that are typically provided in the Constitution. But outside of those constitutionally protected areas, how, for example, does the federal government influence things like dropout rate? Or how does the federal government influence things like anti-smoking campaigns or things like that, which obviously are not mentioned in the Constitution, but the federal government does that. And the way that they do that is by funding of programs. So it's a key thing to remember. Federal government influences your public schools in your state primarily by funding, because they will provide you money if you will follow their regulations. The biggest and the best known and the most comprehensive education law that's passed by the federal government that we all work with is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and it's often called ESEA. So if you hear that acronym, of course those of us in education are just overwhelmed by acronyms, but if you hear ESEA, it's talking about the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And that was originally passed back in 1965. Your book does an excellent job of giving the history behind Elementary and Secondary Education Act. But up until that time, up until about 1965, the federal government had very little to do with public education. There were a few examples like desegregation cases where the federal government did step in and took a role in public education. But in general, the federal government had very little to do with that. But starting in the 1960s with President Johnson and his Great Society movement, you begin to see the federal government pushing into local school districts more, primarily related to causes to deal with poverty. And so ESEA was passed in 1965, and that's the first time when the federal government is starting to push out large amounts of money into local school districts so that they can help deal with things that, like I said, primarily related to poverty. And so that was really the first step. And the portions of that law, ESEA, were called titles. Now, one thing I want to set aside just briefly is, depending how long you've been in education, that title term can change. Because there was a time back in the late 80s, early 90s, that for whatever reason, the federal government changed the parts of ESEA and called them chapters. So we went from Title I to Chapter 1. But there was so much confusion over that. Then in the 1990s, they switched back to titles. So I just throw that out as an aside, because every once in a while, you'll still hear people talk about the Title I program as the Chapter 1 program. It's all the same. It was just basically over the years of ESEA, they had changed the titles to chapters, but now we're back on titles. So if there's any confusion about that, especially for people that were active in education in the 80s and 90s, sometimes it's hard for those of us that were at that time to get our titles correct. But right now, the parts of that law, ESEA, were called titles. Now, ESEA is reauthorized. Basically, it says it's going to run until it's passed again by the federal government, by Congress. And if you look over the history of ESEA since 1965, typically every 6 to 8 years it was reauthorized or reapproved. And with each reauthorization, there were changes part of ESEA that may have changed the focus slightly, but in general it hasn't changed that much as far as the main goals of ESEA. But so right now, in fact, and I'm taping this particular lecture in August of 2010. Right now, this is a hot topic in Washington. In fact, I was in Washington just about 3 weeks ago, and Congressman Skelton, I was in Congressman Skelton's office, and he was talking about reauthorization of ESEA. It's due. I mean, in fact, they're past due on the time that they should have reauthorized ESEA, but because of the change in administrations from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, they're having a delay on reauthorization of ESEA. But over that time, roughly every 6 to 8 years, they'll reauthorize it, change some things in a minor fashion typically, but there can be some major changes. The last reauthorization, and again I'm filming this in August of 2010, the last time it was reauthorized was back in 2001, and it was called, and just as sort of a campaign slogan, the reauthorization of ESEA was called No Child Left Behind. And your book does an excellent job of going through and describing the politics of the reauthorization of ESEA and when it was given the title of No Child Left Behind. It was supported by both Democrats and Republicans, and of course it was signed into law by President Bush, but it was also supported by, like, Senator Kennedy, and it was a bipartisan effort. And so No Child Left Behind and ESEA are the same thing. No Child Left Behind was just a catchy title that was given to ESEA when it was reauthorized. Okay? So whenever ESEA was reauthorized in 2011, and we'll just call it No Child Left Behind for now, and that's currently the law of the land until it goes through Congress. And like I said, as of August of 2010, it has not gone through, and they tell me it'll be a couple years before the final reauthorization is done. But No Child Left Behind, when it was reauthorized, or ESEA when it was reauthorized in 2001 and called No Child Left Behind, it placed a special emphasis, and the slide there shows it. It placed a special emphasis on accountability measures. That was something that had really never been a part of ESEA prior to that time, and it went through and established having states establish a system of assessment and setting proficiency targets for their state and holding them accountable for how well their students did on these tests. And so that accountability measure that was added into ESEA as part of No Child Left Behind was probably the biggest part of that particular legislation. And of course it has become very, very controversial, because as parts of ESEA and No Child Left Behind, we've obviously increased the amount of testing that's offered in the state. We have also made school districts accountable, whereas students or as schools failed to meet proficiency targets, we have to go through and do certain things that we would have never had to do before. Now again, remember back what we've already talked to. Why does the federal government do that? It's because school districts take federal dollars. In theory, a school district could say, we don't want your federal money, and we're not going to take your federal money, and we're not going to follow No Child Left Behind. That's perfectly allowed. But you will find very, very few school districts that will forsake federal funding of their school district without, even if they do have to follow regulations like No Child Left Behind. One of the activities in this particular unit will be where I'll give you the websites, and you're going to go out and see the portion of funding of school districts that come from the federal government, state government, and local government. I'll give you the information where you can check that. And I want you to check your school district and a number of other school districts in your area, and you'll see that while the numbers slide, and there are basically three sources of revenue in education. You've got local property taxes, you've got money that comes from the state, in our case the state of Missouri, and then you've got money that comes from the federal government. In most cases, the federal government is the smallest amount of money, but it is still a huge part of the budget of a school district. And I really don't know of any school districts that have said they don't want any federal money in order to avoid following laws like ESEA, which we're going to call No Child Left Behind. But again, the key point is that if you take federal money, you must follow the regulations established, in this case, by No Child Left Behind. Okay? As part of No Child Left Behind, currently there are 10 titles, basically 10 portions of No Child Left Behind. And each one has a special area that it's going to take on. And I'm just going to briefly run through these, and then I'm going to go into more detail about specific titles in this unit. But some of the titles, for example, Title I, we will cover in depth in a later unit of this course. So Title I is probably the granddaddy of all these particular parts of No Child Left Behind, or ESEA. But it is so important that we're going to put that as one of the later units in the course, so we're going to talk about those in more detail. But now just a quick summary. I'll go into more detail about some that probably will not impact you much in your school district. They're still important, but they probably don't involve as much money or as much regulation. And then in later portions of the course, we'll go through and talk about Title I. In fact, Title I, Title II, and Title III will be mentioned later in the course. So let's talk about Title I. It's the one that probably most schools hear the most about. Now let me just say that Title I relates to, like it says on the bullet there, improving the academic achievement of the disadvantaged. So if you come from a fairly wealthy school district, you're probably not Title I, as far as if the student population, if you have a very low population of students living in poverty, or a very low population of students living on free and reduced lunch, or qualifying for free and reduced lunches, you probably are not a Title I school. And but if you live in an area with a high amount of poverty and a high amount of students that qualify for free and reduced lunches, you probably are a Title I school. If you're Title I, You're receiving an extra amount of federal money to support your Title I programming, and you're required to follow the regulations that's set aside for that. So Title I, and again we'll go into more details in later units, but basically just an understanding that it involves achievement specifically targeted towards those students that are economically disadvantaged. Title II deals with preparing, training, and recruiting high-quality teachers and principals. Title II is basically a way that says that the federal government says if you're going to accept federal funds, your teachers must be highly qualified. Really the only impact that I can think of in school districts that I have worked in is that we have to report this information a lot more than we used to. You know, most school districts will hire certified people, and obviously they go out and look for people that are qualified to teach the subjects that the teachers are working in. But to be honest with you, in the past, we would have never had to have reported that information to the federal government at least, but now we are required to report those that have the appropriate certifications and appropriate degrees. And you know, sometimes it's extremely challenging. If you haven't worked in school administration, you may live in a very small school district and you cannot find a qualified math teacher, a person that has a math certificate. And you may be desperate and have to find somebody that may be an elementary certificated person that's very, very good in math because nobody else has applied. Well, Title II, that would be something that you would have to report, and whenever your percentage gets to a certain amount, there are remedies that you have to make. So basically that involves with preparing, training teachers and administrators and retaining them. And basically, like I said, my experience with that has just been it requires us to report them more. But in many cases, it has been a hardship because schools will struggle to find qualified applicants in their school district. Title III is one that we'll definitely talk about later. It typically relates to English language learners, like the bullet says there, Title III, language instruction for limited English proficient and immigrant students. I've got an interview later on in the course with Jennifer Shackles from MEL, which is an organization that helps school districts work on issues related to English language instruction. And again, you just need to know that Title III is part of that, and we'll cover that later in the course. Title IV, 21st Century School. I'm going to talk more about that in this unit in a separate lecture when I talk to you about a program that I have experience with, which is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program. That's a separate lecture. But basically, Title IV offers money across a wide variety of areas, but basically what that's doing is trying to push innovative thinking into schools that would things like after-school programming, technology, things like that. Your book does a good job of summarizing Title IV, and in a later lecture, I'll be talking about the 21st Century Community Learning Centers grant that I administer, and it is an example of Title IV funding. And I'll go through and explain in that second lecture, or that other lecture, about how we've used that Title IV funding and also by writing a grant to try to get that Title IV funding and what we're using it for. So we'll give you sort of an idea of an actual title program in action. Then Title V is promoting informed parental choices and innovative programs. I'll talk about that more here in just a second. Then Title VI, flexibility and accountability. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here in a second too. Title VII relates to Indian, Native Hawaiian, and Alaska Native education. And that's interesting because in many cases, Title VII, you could work an entire career in the state of Missouri and never have any relationship to Title VII if you have a small population of Indian, Native Hawaiian, or Alaska Native education. So it really is based on what school district you're working in. If you're working in extreme southwest Missouri, down in the McDonald County area, or right along the Oklahoma border, or if you go on and become an administrator in Oklahoma, or in lands where there are a lot of Native Americans, you will become very informed by Title VII programming. But if you live in an area that doesn't have a whole lot of diversity, you may never have any experience with Title VII programming. So that's a unique situation depending on your student population. Title VIII is impact aid programs. I'm going to talk about that more here in a minute because that may impact many of you. And then Title IX, it's labeled in No Child Left Behind ESEA as general provisions. The one that we most hear about is gender equity, and I'm going to talk about that later when I talk more about Title IX compliance, especially related to competitive sports. But that is another regulation. You take federal money, then you must, in this particular case that I'm going to use as an example, gender equity. But your chapter spells out a whole bunch of other areas that Title IX impacts. And so there's a reason it's called general provisions, because Title IX is more just than gender equity in sports. Then Title X is an odd name, and it basically deals with repeals, redesignations, and amendments of other statutes. I must admit, I've never heard of Title X in my job, but after reading more about it, I found out that there are a number of things that are included in Title X that we call something different. It's just never called Title X. So basically, I think it was a catch-all of things that were made as far as revisions in the law whenever it was reauthorized in 2001 and became No Child Left Behind. By the way, on page 2 of your text, you'll see a nice graph that goes through and spells out all of those particular titles. And it is important for you to have just a general understanding of the titles, and not that you need to memorize them, but again, it gives you sort of an idea about the broad scope of the federal title programs. Okay? In your book, on pages 2 through 5, it does a great job of talking about the history of No Child Left Behind and how Democrats and Republicans back in 2000, 2001 came together and modified ESEA and called it No Child Left Behind. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. It is interesting because, as all of us that work in education realize, it is about politics in many cases. And I'm going to talk more detail right now about Titles 1, 2, and 3. And I promise you, especially Title I, we're going to talk about in a later unit in the course. And in fact, Title I director is one of the people that you're required to interview for this course on the assignment, on your first assignment that I gave you, where you're going out and interviewing practitioners. Title I is so important to many school districts. But now I want to talk specifically about Titles 1, 2, and 3, because they are ones that probably are the most commonly referred to right now. Oh no, I'm lying to you. I'm not going to talk about them now because we're going to talk about those in later units. Sorry about that. Titles 1, 2, and 3 we'll talk about in later units. Now I'm going to go into more detail on these particular ones because we probably will not be mentioning them later in the course. Let's talk about Title 4, which is the 21st century, it's labeled 21st century schools in ESEA or No Child Left Behind. And I've just listed the wide variety there on the bullets, the wide variety of areas that are covered by Title IV funding. Just in general, some of the funding that comes through federal title programs is allocated on a per pupil basis. So you just get your share of the money, and then it allows the school district to sort of implement them in a wide array of programs. But other forms of Title I money, it's very, very prescribed. You will spend this money only on safe and drug-free schools, for example. And you will get an allocation typically by student population, but you'll only get that specific amount. So it can be, you get an allocation because of student population, and you can spend it in any area, in a broad area, based on what you decide in your local school district. You'll get an allocation based on your student population that's used on a very specific scope. And then other sources of funding are through competitive grant models. So there might be grants that are available that use Title IV funding, but you have to apply for it. You've got to go through and develop your needs and the steps that you would use with the money, and then you have to apply for these grants, and then you will receive them to implement the program. And they aren't, not all schools will get them, that you'll get on a competitive grant basis. So this title funding can come to a school in a variety of different ways. But I just listed some of these things that are included in Title IV. Safe and drug-free schools and communities money. That's where a lot of schools will do things like DARE, or will bring police officers in the school to do training on like drug prevention and alcohol prevention training, and so that money will come to schools that way. By the way, in the state of Missouri, we've always received an allocation of that where it's just set aside, and they call it safe and drug-free schools money, and we could spend it in those areas. Just this year, and again I'm doing this in 2010, that money's been cut off and it's been reallocated in different areas. So even the state of Missouri, even though it's federal money, the state of Missouri in many cases gets to decide how that money will be sent in their state. So Missouri has changed the regulation on that, and up until 2010 we would receive a pot of money typically in my district, and I have about 1,800 kids in my district, typically we'd receive less than $4,000, and we could spend it on anything that we wanted as long as it was in the safe and drug-free schools area. And in the past, I can think of I spent that on lightning detectors for campuses, and I've spent that on radios. I've spent that on training for teachers that would relate to safe and drug-free schools. But starting in 2010, 2011 school district, that money has been cut off from the state of Missouri. So Missouri, like I said, gets the ability to modify that money that's been channeled from Washington to Jefferson City, and Jefferson City has changed the way that we're getting that funding on Title IV. The data management of safety and drug use, that's another thing that's included in Title IV, which basically says that whenever you have discipline referrals in your office, and by the way, this is an extremely important practical lesson to those of you that are going to become building principals, is that you will have to report discipline referrals, not only the count of discipline referrals, but by gender and by race. And so most school districts will have a database system that keeps that for you. If John Turner has gotten in trouble for something, as I enter that discipline referral into the student information system, it will generate a report at the end of the year for me to go through and say, this is how many males, females have had discipline referrals. This is the discipline referral count by ethnicity. And it'll go through and compare the number of out-of-school suspensions and things like that. That's all part of a Title IV report that you'll have to do at the end of the year. And so it's extremely important as you're going through and doing discipline referrals that, again, to ask that question. I'm sure if you've got a computerized student information system, I'm sure it's done. But if you happen to go to one of those few schools anymore that does not have an electronic discipline module, you're going to have to figure out a system to go through and do that. I used to have to do it by paper and pencil back when I first became a principal, that had to go through and calculate that by hand, and the computer is obviously the better way to do it. But anyway, Title IV is the one that forces us to maintain that information. Another thing included in Title IV is things like technology funding, community service funding, mentoring funding. And by the way, mentoring and community service are typically by competitive grants. You write a grant for community service projects, and if it's a good enough one, you'll get an award from Title IV to fund that. And also Title IV is the one that says that there'll be no handgun or guns on campuses. 21st century community learning centers, and I'm going to talk about that in a separate lecture so that this one doesn't get crazy long, but that's one that I have experience with. And it's also the one that has a smoking ban that says that there'll be no smoking on campuses. You take federal money, you can't allow them to smoke on your campus. You don't take any federal money, they can all smoke, I guess. But anyway, but some of those things impact you in a school, in that particular case, by Title IV. Then we talk about Title V is things like parental choice and innovation. And this is an example of things that you may not ever hear Title V talked about, but trust me, it will impact you. That Title V is the one that does a lot of the regulations related to charter schools, physical education programs, gifted education programs, even foreign exchange programs are included in Title V. Now, with the new accountability through No Child Left Behind in testing, it's also the one that Title V is the one that allows parents to move children away from low-performing schools. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail about that now. But if you are in a more suburban area or urban area, that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. If a school district is a low-performing school and the students are doing poorly on a test, parents have the right to send their children to a school outside of where they live, and the low-performing school where they actually live in has to pay the tuition for that. Okay, so that's becoming a big, big issue. Now in Southwest Missouri, I haven't heard of that becoming an issue, but especially in suburban and metropolitan areas, that Title V mandate that allows parents to move their kids away from low-performing schools is becoming more and more important. Title V increased accountability on test performance, and we also have to publish those results now. And so now, when MAP test results come out, I think we probably all shared our test results in the past, but since 2001, it's mandated how those are published and pushed out to the community so that people can go through and see how their school districts, or for that matter, any school district in the state of Missouri, is doing on the tests that we're administering. And also Title V also relates to technology. I think more in Title V related to how we keep records, like on things like discipline. And also mandates parent involvement that says parents will be active and informed and we will keep in contact and establish systems of communication with parents. So that's all included in Title V. Then Title VII is an example of one, again, where depending on your school district, you may have little or no involvement with Title VII, but Title VII provides funding for those schools with significant levels of American Indian, Native American, or Alaskan Native, and Hawaiian Native students in them, and it provides a special source of funding. And there are also a good number of grants that are targeted just to those specific populations so that they can provide innovative programs and instructional programs for that unique subgroup of a student population, in many cases a majority of the student population. Okay? Title VIII is impact aid, and this is really an interesting one depending on what school district you're in. Most of us will never get any Title VIII money because because of where it implies. And look at that first bullet there: schools that educate children living on federal property. Okay. Now, believe it or not, most school districts have some land that's owned by federal government. Okay, and we're not talking about if you have just any amount of federally owned property. We're talking about schools that educate children living on federal property, and typically it's going to be a large amount of property. And typically, the ones I hear about most are ones that have land that have large portions of their school district in the national forest, and those that surround military bases of some sort. And if you are in those areas where you are, and there may be other examples that I don't know of, like I said, national forest and military bases are the two I hear about the most. But if you are in areas where there's large areas of your land mass that's in your school district is owned by the federal government, this is a special allocation that's given to those school districts to build facilities and construction. And two examples that I can think of: Winona, which is down in the south central part of Missouri, and that's been a few years back, but Winona got a sizable amount of money from Title VIII Impact Aid to construct school buildings down there. And so, because they're in the middle of the national forest. So especially in southern Missouri, they can think of those school districts that have large portions of their geography that it makes up their school district included, like in Mark Twain National Forest. Many of them will qualify for Title VIII Impact Aid money, and basically that's what the federal government is saying, is that obviously the federal government doesn't pay local property tax. And that's a huge portion of your funding in most school districts, is the property tax that owners of land pay to the school district. Well, the federal government, if they own land in your school district, they don't pay any property tax. So basically what Title VIII does, it says since you've got a huge portion of your land that is you're not drawing income for because of property taxes, that they will give you a special allocation of money to try to make up for that money that you've lost because that land is owned by the federal government. So I guess what I would say is, if you work in a school district that is not around a military base, national forest, things like that, it's probably not going to impact you. But if you happen to work in school districts that are around those areas, then you will do it. And the other examples I put on there, like Waynesville, at Fort Leonard Wood, and Knob Noster for Whiteman Air Force Base, all those school districts around those particular areas definitely have impact aid because they have portions of land that are owned by the federal government. Then the last area, and I didn't put a particular title on this, but just general things that are included in there in part. Things like McKinney-Vento, and we'll talk about McKinney-Vento later on because that's becoming more and more important in education, and basically that's the Homeless Education Assistance Improvements Act. And basically that says that if students are homeless, you need to provide special instructional support and services. And the reason we're going to talk about that later is because I think a lot of us don't even realize what qualifies a person as homeless. I mean, it's not just somebody living in the back of their car, which that's obviously homeless, but that can be people that have gone back to move in with grandma and granddad. So you've got grandma and granddad, and then their children and all the grandchildren. Well, the children and the grandchildren all count as homeless, even though they're living in a home. So there's a lot. So we're going to talk more later in the course about McKinney-Vento because that's something I think a lot of school districts are dropping the ball on. They think in their mind that somebody's either going to be living in a hotel or in the back of a car to count as homeless, and that's definitely not the case. And not only is it important to provide those students with special support because obviously they need it because of the extenuating circumstances and the hardship of being homeless, but also that's a significant source of revenue for your school district if you have a large enough population of those students that count as homeless in McKinney-Vento. But we'll talk about that later. And it also requires you to designate a district homeless coordinator. That's included in No Child Left Behind. And it also does there are regulations in there that if you are a school district that is designated as persistently dangerous, meaning that it's got high amounts of violence and things like that, just like we've got the ability for parents to change school districts because of the poor academic performance of a school district, there are also provisions in No Child Left Behind, ESEA, that will allow parents to leave the school district because of the persistently violent nature of the school district. And again, I think typically that relates to urban areas, but that may come up down the road depending on what schools you work in at a later date. So that sort of gives you a general introduction of the title programs. Many of those titles there we'll not talk about again in this unit, but I think it's extremely important for you to understand that those title programs are important. The reason we're following them is because almost all public schools, in fact all public schools that I know of, accept federal funding. And if you accept federal funding, you're required to follow those regulations. If in theory you wanted to say, we're not going to accept any federal dollars in our school district, the 10th Amendment would say that that is the prerogative of a state, and they could do that. But because of the large amount of money that is pushed into school districts, most of us say that it's worth the additional effort and the things that we must follow in order to accept that money. So that's the key concept you need to know. Again, many of those titles part of ESEA or No Child Left Behind are things that you may never deal with depending on the location and the student population of your school, but many of them you'll hear a lot about. And especially titles 1, 2, and 3 we're going to talk about later in the course. But that gives you a good background on federal title programs and why we must follow federal regulations, even though the 10th Amendment says that we may not have to.